Good morning, and thank you for joining this morning's panel discussion regarding solutions for achieving and maintaining safeguards rule compliance. As you may know, updated amendments to the safeguards rule, I think something like 140 something pages of new amendments went into effect a few weeks ago on January 10th. Today's panelists include Doug Fusco of Dealer Safeguard Solutions, Chris Cleveland of Comply Auto, and Michael DeShiel of AutoTrieve. They are joined by Judy Van of JV Solutions. The webinar will basically show dealers how to manage the new regulations and protect their dealership. We're going to throw a lot of information at you over the next hour. We will be recording this webinar and posting it to the website later today. So if you go too fast or you miss something, you'll be able to go back and see what was presented. Before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping details. On the right-hand side of your screen is a control panel, and when you take particular note of the questions tab. During the call, all participants will be muted. If you have a question, please submit it in the questions tab, and it will be addressed at the end of the discussion. So now I'd like to turn things over to Judy to formally introduce Doug, Chris, and Michael and get the discussion going. Judy?
Great, thank you, Brian. And good morning, everybody, and thank you again for taking time out of your very busy schedule. For those of you who are on the call that were on the call that we did back in January, right before the amendments took place, this will be a different format. The purpose of today's program and the goal is to help you navigate through all of the regulatory issues that you're going to have to face in your dealership, kind of line by line. We do have our three partners on the call to kind of go through how their programs work and how it directly is affected into the regulation. We all know, as Brian said, it was updated for the first time since 2002, went from 2 pages to 145 pages. And we know that on a daily basis, we've got over 110 regulations that we have to comply with. If you look at the NADA regulatory maze, every department of our dealership has issues that we have to comply with. But amazingly, how one regulation could upset our whole world. And the changes in this one regulation are very onerous. So we want to make sure that everybody understands what they're going to need to do this year. Some of the things that Chris will go over with us later went into effect in January, and a lot of it's going to be due December 9th of this year, but there's a lot of work that has to go into play before that. We know that the FTC is the one who basically had been working on these amendments for the last couple of years, and the FTC is the only one who could take a federal fine and increase it for inflation. So in 2002, the FTC enforcement fine was $43,792, which just went up to $46,517 for 2022. I'm sorry, it should be 2022. So
it actually used to be like $11,000 back in the day.
Yeah, that's funny, Chris, you said that, because it started $11,000 when I got started with the safeguards rule way back when. Then I believe it went to $16,000 in 2008. In 2018, They took $40,000. And they've been increasing it every year since. So it is quite amazing that they can do that. So, obviously, why do we need to comply? We always have the conversation. I've been in a lot of your stores that we are, considered a financial institution by definition. We do execute loans and leases on a daily basis. So the comprehensive information security program that you all may have put into place back in 2003, 2004, 2008 with the red flags rule, those binders obviously are some very outdated, need to be updated if you haven't done it recently. But Chris is going to go over the technical changes that have happened in October, were passed in December. So I'll leave that for Chris. But the administrative, technical, physical safeguards that we have to put in place every day is very onerous on our business. And that's all we really want to do is sell, service, and sell parts and retain our customers. So why do we have to comply with these regulations? Well, it's something that we have to do. It's very onerous, and there's a lot of things that can happen if we don't. So what do we do in the dealership? Obviously, when it comes to customer information, privacy, the information we collect, we obviously collect, create, and control. We call it the 3 C's of what we do in the dealership. And how do we manage the collection, the creation, and the control? And obviously, software can help us with that. Some of you have systems already in place that may be very adequate, and some of you may not. So hopefully, based on today's presentation, you'll be able to see where your pitfalls are. You can do your own risk assessment in your dealership and figure out what your needs are. But it's a lot easier to manage those needs if you know what you need to do and how you need to do it. So with that, I'm going to turn the first part of it over, which is the collection and the creation, over to Doug. So Doug, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you formed your company?
Sure. Started the company actually 13 years ago last month, and started to solve a problem that still exists today, which is the one that you just addressed, which is frankly the disconnect in most showrooms between what we train to happen, what we document is supposed to happen, and what actually happens, right? And you know, it's certainly worse on a Saturday afternoon than it is on a Monday morning. And when we started the company, the showroom was kind of the last piece of the dealership that didn't have technology. You know, we had accounting systems, inventory systems, purchasing systems, F&I systems, but the paperwork that you mentioned, you know, collecting, processing, controlling, you know, still today in many dealerships is paper. So dealers have trained and documented and done compliance reviews for years, and the return on investment has been less than desirable. So, you know, we kind of took the approach that said there's got to be a better way. Let's put some technology in place that helps the dealers at their busiest times, just like their slowest times, make sure that they have a consistent process, which is what, you know, the underlying thread of this is. We can't just be good on a Monday morning, can't just be good for the first week after training. We have to be consistent every day in enforcing these processes.
So by looking at your program, what do you see as the biggest violation that sales departments and dealerships engage in that create the risk for the dealership regarding non-public information?
I think it was 2 areas, and it's probably grown to 3 with the pandemic, right? One area was dealers still are challenged with really, you know, protecting the paperwork in the showroom. And the new requirements, 145 pages, excuse me, have 3 pretty broad but pretty specific requirements. Limit who can access customer data, right? Second one is must explain information sharing practices, specifically the administrative, technical, and physical safeguards, which is all outlined in your privacy statement, hopefully. And then it goes on to discuss basically anything you could possibly do with a document: access, collect, distribute, process, protect, store, use, transmit, or anything else they can think of, right? And dealers, you know, are challenged with that. You go into any showroom on a Saturday afternoon or any busy time, it's just different degrees of how good or bad that is typically. That one's been there forever. I think dead deals are a challenge as a result of that. Dealers typically do a good job with sold deals because they go from the showroom to the desk to finance to accounting, and the dead deals, you know, we get busy, we get distracted, less administrative consistency on that. The newest one, though, is with the pandemic and the walls come crashing down and the transactions now done virtually outside the store, we still have the same responsibility to, you know, protect that information. And there's text messages going in with pay stubs and insurance cards, and hey, the email server's down at the dealership, send it to my Gmail account. There are still salespeople that think their cell phones, you know, their own personal copy machine. And unfortunately, with the pandemic and the extension of the showroom and the obligation to still complete the deal, collect the paperwork, try and do it as quickly as possible, there's lots of shortcuts that get taken. And the fact that that information is going to personal devices really puts the dealer in a pretty precarious situation because it's a direct violation of their privacy statement. And that's while the salesperson's still working for me. Let's not even think about what happens if I get mad today and I go to the Honda store across the street and start working there tomorrow with prospects on my cell phone, right? So those are the violations that I see. It's just not consistent enforcement of the information we're collecting from our customers.
So what's the dealership's responsibility for clearing red flags and preventing fraud in the dealership, and how does your platform help that?
Yeah, obviously red flags are built into all the credit reporting providers as well as Dealer Track and Route 1. And it's, you know, it's a tool that makes an analysis and decides what the propensity is for discrepancies or fraud, address discrepancies, the C socials, things like that. And, you know, if you don't have a cleared red flag and the car gets delivered and there's a problem, it falls back on the dealer, right? And same thing with fraud. Previous to some of the fraud tools that are out there today, you know, we inspect the driver's license. We do our best to, you know, does this look like a real driver's license? Does it look like it's altered? Does the information match what's on the credit report, et cetera? And those have been challenges, again, for a number of years. And basically, you know, with the platform that we provide to many of the dealers in New Jersey already, we have dials that we can turn where you can control the behavior. So if I've got 4 desk managers that are really good at red flags and 2 that aren't, we have the ability to turn the dial on those 2 desk managers, and they literally can be restricted from seeing that credit score till they clear the red flags. And it's attribute based. You may not want it for, you know, an address discrepancy. You may want it for a deceased social or an invalid social. So you can turn the dials to start to drive the behavior to make sure that you're protected. And, you know, with fraud, the second piece of this, about 3 years ago, you know, we rolled out a fraud platform. There are many platforms out there today, and they're all good, that scan driver's licenses. All the CRM vendors do it. We actually detect immediately if that's a fake ID and send off alerts to the appropriate folks in the dealership, not just for in-store, but also outside the store. You know, basically, I can send a link to a customer now that says, hey, we need a copy of your driver's license to finish up the deal. It doesn't get texted to a cell phone, doesn't go to an email account. It comes directly back into their digital deal jack. And if it's fraudulent, we send off an alert for that as well. So I now have the ability to verify, even when that customer's not present, whether that's a valid driver's license or not.
So most dealerships do have, obviously they have their CRM, they have their DMS program. How does adding another program, does it take longer? Does it speed up the process? How does it work? How does it interface?
Well, I wouldn't look at it as another program. I'd look at it as a better mousetrap, because I'm going to go through the same steps on the road to the sale that I do, whether I have dealer safeguards or not. We're going to ask for a driver's license. We're going to ask for an insurance card. We're going to complete a credit app and a privacy statement. We're going to then run credit. We have to retain our dead deal. We then might need to go get some steps. All those things happen in both systems. All we try and do with the platform is, where available, put a better mousetrap in, like the fraud detection tools. And in those areas where the processes break down, when we get busy on a Saturday and I forget or skip a step, or we'll go back and do it later, we can lock that process down. I mean, if you walk through the road to the sale, every dealer in the country, if you really go into their documented policies and procedures, kind of has some version of the hit list up on the screen. We don't want paperwork out. We need to make sure we support all the fair credit reporting obligations for consent and permissible purpose and retention. Have to store our dead deals. Make sure we don't take shortcuts when we get busy. I mean, the list goes on and on. The platform that we have eliminates every one of those things by putting a piece of technology in based on your documented policies and procedures that make sure every day in every dealership, every time, we've got a forced march in place that complements. We're not going to change your CRM system, not going to change desking, not going to change F&I. We're going to sit in front of the CRM system and say, hey, you probably shouldn't waste 45 minutes with this customer on a Saturday. This is a fake ID, right? So give me the tools to make my process better, make me spend the time where I need to. And when we're herding cats, when the inventory and the customers and the cars come back, I've got a process already entrenched that locks all that down based on my policies.
Great, thank you, Doug. So I think Brian mentioned to everybody, you can type questions into the chat of this so that we can get your questions answered during the presentation for each expert that's on the panel. So if you have any questions as we go through this, please type them in so we can get them answered. We'll have a few more in the Q&A at the end. So that kind of took us through what we collect, what we create. So collect the driver's license, the maybe insurance card, any STIPs that we may need, and store them electronically, right, Doug? And then the second part is creating the credit application and the integrity of the credit application, and then also detecting fraud. So that's how we're starting with the beginning. Now let's talk about what we have to control. So with what we control in the dealership, we always know that there's an issue with paper or with files. And actually there was tornado recently at a dealership that blew the roof off, and file jackets went for miles apart. So we know that there's always an issue with our files. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael DeShiel.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having us here. Thank you, Judy, and thank you, everyone. Michael DeShiel here. I'm Managing Director from Autotrieve.com. We do compliant document scanning as a service, and by the way, thank you for talking about blowing the roof off, if nothing else, this morning. That is that flood, fire, and the 7 scourges. Anything can happen, but what goes on with these additions to the safeguard rule and all those pages is it really blows the roof off, if nothing else. So just to go a little bit about us, actually, we date back. Our parent is a company by the name of Micrographic Information Services that owns the 2 service brands, I Need a File, which is focused squarely on corporate users, Fortune 1000s for the past almost 40 years, and the service brand Autotrieve, which I head up on the business development side for about the past decade, in effect. And so we cut our teeth many years ago within traditional corporate insurance companies, retailers, healthcare, a lot of the names that we would know if I were to mention, and built a variety of different solutions for those users over the course of the years. Anything ranging from automated invoice processing to digital imaging, on through various workflow services, in effect. And there's about 100 or so users, and whether they be St. Barnabas, Robert Wood Johnson, or Northwell Health, Tiffany, Louis Vuitton. We have no access to those bags, if nothing else. But in any event, we've done a lot in that space for many years. About a decade ago, this is almost the 3M stick-it note story that happened. My principal, Rick Manis, the fellow that I work for, had been for many years buying cars from one of the larger groups of rooftops. And that then general manager had an issue with a loft that was filled with lots of paper, and it was a huge audit. It was a manufacturer audit that was undergoing about $50 million in query, in effect. And none of this paper was in order. In fact, it was in contractors' bags. Out of order and not indexed and not put together. We were tasked with putting it together and making it searchable and retrievable. And thus, at the end of the day, miraculously, a check went back to the franchise, which is something was almost unheard of. We realized there was a lot more behind the curtain. We began to pursue automotive, and in conjunction with New Jersey Car primarily, and that we are Jersey grown, born, although we have a national footprint and service about 400 rooftops throughout the U.S. with a heavy concentration in the Northeast and predominance in New Jersey. In any effect, and that put us on the trail of doing a whole lot in the way of not only service, but also on the deal front and HR and automated invoicing. So that kind of cues up, what it is that we do. So we're a service bureau coast to coast that really appeals to the needs of dealers to help them mitigate risk. You have a question, Judy?
Yeah, so what's the advantage to document scanning for dealerships when it comes to service and sales?
Well, service and sales, it's tricky. I mean, these are paper factories. I really contend that in a paperless world, there's more paper. That's really the way of, and there is. In a wireless world, there's more wires. We just don't see them, basically. So, particularly in the area of service, it constantly is sitting around. It may not have been filed. If it's filed, it's very often 50% or more of the time it is not found or refiled, in effect, and auditors are very hip to that, so that becomes a real issue. And in the way of deals, I think we all know we're talking about expansion of 2 pages to 140 some odd pages with with FTC rules and regs. The amount of risk that sits within that content is just absolutely overwhelming. And we all know that, and we're on the control side of this discussion, right, within the 3 C's. But we've got credit reporting information, we've got credit card information, we've got socials, we've got bank account information, and it's just incredibly risky to have that sitting around unfiled. I've seen it often enough, and without just sitting around in public hallways, or in the secure document area where we see the picture of the we see the picture, the camera and the circle and the line through it, and no cat with a camera in the center of it. Meanwhile, I walked into that office with a camera. So it really is very risky having that sit around, and very, very costly to process as well internally.
So why does it make sense to have all customer information backed up in a separate cloud? Because some dealers are already doing this to a certain degree.
Well, let's talk about that. It's a really, really good question. We have, whether you're Azure or Amazon Web Services, in effect, often enough, you really need to seek out the following credentials. Very important. And again, I'm not deeply technical, but ISO 9000 and then SOC 1, SOC 2, annually audited and certified. These are really the key elements for seeing to it that you're in the right place with a vendor that's providing these service bureau services for you, in effect. So you want to be sure that it's secure, and also too, in all fairness, even in the DMS enterprises, which we write back to and we extract from, customers like an additional layer of backup if they've ever parted company from one DMS platform moving to the next. We provide, no pun intended, a safeguard in that respect that helps dealers to mitigate that risk, where they own their own information all the time, regardless of what it is they're doing with DMS and whatnot.
So you've got two issues here. You can scan in service, you can scan in sales. So if you're scanning in service, let's talk about repair orders for a minute.
Yep.
What happens if you want to add another form, after the deal has been done? How do you access and how do you add?
Really, really, really simple. Again, we offer, a couple of different modes of service. The more popular is pickup and shipping of documents to us, in effect, and largely, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is labor and the availability of labor and what the impact of COVID and cost and whatnot. But they can be picked up, marked, and appended to the file very, very simply on an ordinary schedule, or they can be self-scanned or even dragged and dropped through a portal and inserted as well. So there are a couple of different means that are completely secure, that allow for the appendage or the appending of a file to make it accessible in a timely way.
Okay, and then on the deal jacket side, if a customer has more than one car, will his information be listed under his name? How do you identify?
If we're operating by name, we'll see multiple vehicles. If you're doing search by VIN, that will be the specific vehicle. So a lot depends on the amount of data that we have populated within the customer profile to allow for that search. But the answer would be, if it were searched by name, it would indicate that alone multiple vehicle.
So we see a lot of backlog in the dealerships. Let's talk about the labor for a minute and how that works.
Sure. I'm really tired from lifting boxes. No, I kid you not. I occasionally do put boxes in the car. So we have a fleet of vehicles, our own vehicles, fully insured, bonded employee drivers. And the question again, just remind again. I lost my train of thought.
Well, we're talking about the reduced labor and rising costs in labor and how.
Yeah. So about labor, I mean, one of the things that we can thank the governor and others for is the rising cost of labor, and that added to COVID. We found that backlogs have been tremendous. That added to the question of how long it is that you retain. So we've been extremely busy just in helping dealers to get current and clean up the backlogs that have really, compiled or accrued over the course of months and years, in effect. And very often it's the case that dealers just can't even keep current anyway, given the current cost to labor and current headcount. And then the question is, what are they doing from a quality control standpoint? How often it is the case that I see that person answering the phone, cashiering and scanning, doing three things, or the part-time labor that picks up where the other person left off, the gaps in completion. These all become big questions. So our job is, we operate a couple of hundred people in-house, round the clock, 24/7, 365, that do nothing but the onboarding of those documents, the tracking, the quality control, paperclip, staple removal, hand feed, quality, and all as such. So, and we do that, within our borders, within the state of New Jersey, with our own labor. None of this reaches, goes to any other borders or outside, basically.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. All right, so now we're going to turn over to Chris Cleveland. He's our newest partner and he's going to go over probably what everybody's here today as to what's going on now. So Chris, can you give us some background on yourself, how you started, and then we'll get into what's going on now.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. So a lot of you probably saw Compliado and myself on the most recent webinar that NJCAR did for the revised FTC safeguards rule. So my company was kind of founded and created organically. I was the compliance director at Galpin Motors for about 10 years. Galpin's a large dealership group, many of you may know, in Southern California. And my co-founders were also dealer attorneys and dealer operators with multiple groups in California as well. And we really created the product for our own dealerships because of all these complex privacy and cybersecurity regulations that are both, seem to never end now on both the state and federal level. Obviously, cybersecurity and privacy has been one of the hottest compliance topics over the past, 5 years. And so we created, it was just manual processes seemed to be outdated, and a lot of these rules had outgrown those manual processes, and we were looking for a solution that could automate and just, let us get back to selling cars, right? And so we created our own solution because there was nothing out there on the market, and it worked so well for our own dealerships that we said, hey, why don't we work on offering this to dealerships across the country? So that's what we've done. So we've been around just a little bit under 2 years, but since then we've become the #1 solution for privacy and cybersecurity for dealers. That number that you see down there is a little outdated now. It's actually 850 dealers we have across the country using Compliado to automate compliance with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and state and federal privacy laws. And actually we've only I think we've had this partnership with New Jersey Car Dealer Association or NJCAR for just under a month, and we've signed up already about 40 New Jersey dealers. So it's been pretty successful. So I know a lot of you on this call have signed up, so thank you. I think there's probably no one better solution to just, if you want to get everything done in one-stop shop for all things federal safeguards and cybersecurity, we're the people. I do want to say real quick, just on the AutoTreeve and DSGSS front, because there's some overlap, with the safeguards rule. Like one thing, for example, under the new revised rules is, not sending out data in an unencrypted format. And having used Doug's software at my own dealerships for, probably 10 years, I can say that, one of the huge benefits is being able to send out like STIP requests via an encrypted format. And there's a tool for that. And that's a huge benefit, because I know when I was at my dealerships, one of the biggest problems was salespeople, sales managers sending requests for driver's licenses and socials, just via text, right? And then there's no way to control that. So you need to provide people with a mechanism to be able to get those things securely in an encrypted format, not via email and text. And what happens, that salesperson leaves, and now they've got a bunch of driver's licenses and STIPs on their phone. It's a mess, right? So that's even just one big benefit. But anyways, yeah, so that's our history, and that's why we kind of call ourselves by dealers for dealers.
Great, thank you. So now can you tell us how the amended changes are going to affect dealerships? And obviously we know why they need to comply, but what are they going to need to do, and what do you think they should do first? So can you go over what exactly is required?
Yeah, so I won't spend too much time on that. I know, NJCAR, again, we already had a webinar that kind of went over all the legal stuff, right? All the different requirements. NJCAR also released a manual, comprehensive manual on step-by-step. But yeah, it's pretty much everything you see right here on this list, right? First of all, every dealership in the US is going to have to comply with this, right? Dealerships fall under the scope of the safeguards rule pretty unambiguously. Dealerships were named specifically as a financial institution in the definition of the new rule. So if there was ever any gray area, which there wasn't really too much, now that's kind of been erased by dealerships specifically being named by the FTC as a covered entity. So all dealers are going to have to do this. Some of the things, as Judy mentioned earlier, already went into effect on January 10th. So the safeguards rule went into effect already, the revised rule. And some of the things have a delayed enforcement provision until December 9th because of COVID and other things, right? But immediately what dealerships are going to want to do is update their written policies, get the required incident response plan, data retention policy, those 4 things you see there, in writing and updated. You're going to want to do that immediately so you can start, complying with that part of the rule, which is already effective. And then I would say designating your qualified individual. The new law requires a single person be designated to oversee your entire cybersecurity and information security program. So I would designate that person or figure out who it's going to be immediately, because a lot of these things, even though they have a delayed enforcement provision until December 9th of this year, it's not stuff you do overnight. For example, completing your risk assessments, there's a new written risk assessment requirement. That's not something you do in a week, right? That's something that takes time because you may identify a lot of risks that you have to fix. So I think, one, get your policies in place, update your policies in accordance with the law. Two, designate that single qualified individual so you can get started on, fixing what you need to fix immediately.
Chris, does that individual have to be a certified person? Do they have to have certification? Do they have to have training? Do they have to be upper management? Who can that?
No, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, I get that question a lot. I mean, if you have an IT person at your dealership or like an IT director on staff, I mean, that's usually the obvious choice, because a lot of the stuff, unlike the old rule, which had to do with like physical, like, hey, don't leave documents unattended, right? Don't leave a credit app on your desk, right? Like a lot of that stuff isn't the focus of the new rule. It's more on the cybersecurity, front, like your IT infrastructure. So the obvious choice, if you have one, is going to be IT director, but the rule is pretty vague and broad. I mean, it allows you to pretty much make it anybody based on your size and complexity as the language the law uses. So it can really be anybody at your dealership as long as they're responsible for overseeing everything. And you can delegate as necessary. I mean, the law even says you can make it a service provider if they're willing to take on that responsibility. So, for example, an outside IT company could even legally be that single person if they're willing to do that for you.
Okay, great. So what's going to be the most difficult requirement for dealers to comply with?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the stuff is going to be, I don't want to say difficult, but it's going to be new, right? These are things that dealerships traditionally were either not doing or not required to do. For example, you see there number 5 and 6, biannual penetration testing or vulnerability assessments and annual penetration tests. Penetration tests is where you do like a simulated hacking against your network, simulated ransomware attacks, simulated password cracking, all sorts of technical, ethical hacks against your dealership, and like what a real life hacker would do. And that can be extremely expensive. And traditionally, most dealerships I talk to have never done a pen test before, right? That's now required by law. So it's not difficult, but it's gonna be something you're gonna have to do that you may have never even thought about or know where to start with that. Same with vulnerability scans or vulnerability assessments, which have to be done every 6 months. Again, something most dealerships haven't traditionally had to worry about, now required by law. Phishing simulations, training your employees on sending simulated phishing emails and seeing whether they'll click on them. Again, a lot of dealerships haven't done that. That's becoming more popular. It's also a really good business practice, but I think those are going to be the difficult things. Also, written risk assessments. That's a very formal process where you go through, document risks, evaluate, how to mitigate that risk and put this all in writing. Some dealerships haven't done that, and they're going to be wondering like, well, where do I start with that? What do I look at? How do I document it? So I think it's just going to be kind of a culture change for dealers, but every dealership's going to have to do this, or else potentially face pretty stiff penalties if, God forbid, they ever had a data breach and the FTC comes knocking.
Now, one of the things listed here is service provider risk assessments. So I guess that in the old rule that was called service provider oversight, and we had to have our service providers kind of sign a form or whatever, and it was almost impossible to get done. How does your program help the dealership with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the core strengths of our program because, and I know this from personal experience working at Galpin, and one of the biggest issues is the vendor stuff, right? It's pretty difficult. I mean, the law says, 1, you have to send out these required contracts, get your vendors who collect NPI to sign it, and 2, now the brand new requirement is they also have to complete a risk assessment for you where you're assessing, how good they are going to be adhering to a lot of these cybersecurity things. So that's difficult because, 1, you got to, who do you send it to, right? A lot of the times you don't even know who the person at the vendor is that's going to sign these contracts. You may have like a regional rep, but they're not going to sign it. And then you got to work your way up the chain, figure out who's going to sign it. Also, you got to track it. What are you going to manually mail them or email them, get a spreadsheet, and they're going to probably redline your version, send it back, right? Because they're going to have changes to it. They may not be willing to sign your version of the contract. So that's kind of where our system, probably one of our core strengths is, because we have over 4,000 dealership vendor templates, and we know at each of those vendors who's signing those agreements. So for example, like, I'll just like Doug, who's on this call, right? I mean, he may be the person signing that at DSGSS, because obviously DSGSS is covered by that because they're collecting MPI. So in our system, you just press DSGSS, it would automatically send it to Doug or whoever it's at DSGSS is signing it, done. Doug's seen it probably hundreds of times because every other vendor who's using us has sent it to Doug already. So it makes it very easy to track and just automate with, built-in DocuSign. Same with the risk assessments. For example, CDK has already done it a few times for everybody else, that they're the largest DMS in the world. And so they would just sign it, and then you'd already have that risk assessment pre-completed because they've applied it to all of the other Compliado dealers. So it makes things like that would be, very manually intensive, human capital intensive, and turns it into a few clicks. So it's a lot easier.
You have 4,000 vendors. How many vendors does the average dealership have?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so I don't have an exact number, but like a good guesstimate, even for a single rooftop, they're sharing personal information, believe it or not, with around 70 different vendors. And people usually are shocked when I say that, like, no way, right? But I mean, think about check guarantee companies. I mean, obviously the normal suspects, CRM, DMS, credit companies, right? Route 1, DealerTrack, DSGSS, right? Document scanning systems like AutoTreat, right? I mean, all these companies that you're dealing with, email blasts, direct mail, right? Equity mining and data mining tools. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And so, yeah, dealerships are traditionally sharing information for a single rooftop with at least usually around 50 to 70 different vendors, if you can believe it.
What happens if a vendor refuses to sign the agreement?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, so according to the FTC, then you shouldn't be doing business with that vendor, right? I mean, the FTC put a footnote in the regulations that basically says, hey, if they're not willing to complete a risk assessment and they're not willing to sign a contract, well, then you, dealership, is responsible, because why are you using this vendor? Why are you allowing them to process and collect your personal information then? And is that real life? No, because, I mean, for example, manufacturers, I mean, they're famous for just saying, I'm not going to sign this, right? And what are you going to do? Not do business with your OEM anymore? Of course not. So there's some practical challenges to that. But I think, the best you can do from a legal standpoint is do your due diligence, attempt to get them signed, send it out, document who's refusing, and you have to kind of use judgment. If it's some, local small vendor, that, is, doesn't really hold the cards, it doesn't have a lot of the, negotiation leverage, then I would say, yeah, you probably, want to think twice about whether to do business with this vendor. If it's your captive bank, like, Ford Motor Credit Company or, Honda Finance or whoever, you're going to be out of luck if they're just refusing to sign it. But I think you'll find that most will. I mean, 90% of vendors, I think, in my experience, will sign it. Some may require a little pressure, or squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, that's a practical challenge under the rule, because the reality is you're not going to get 100% of people to sign it, but you've got to at least document your due diligence. And
you mentioned Honda and Ford. Do banks have to sign these vendor agreements, or are they exempt?
So, that's a gray area. I mean, that's kind of a can of worms, but I mean, a lot of attorneys disagree on that. At a lot of the banks will say, hey, we're not a service provider under the definition of the rule. I mean, obviously they are collecting MPI, socials, finance information, credit reports, all your, the credit worthiness stuff. So from that standpoint, you are sharing that information with them, which is kind of how the rule defines a service provider. But the banks will argue, well, we're not providing a quote unquote service for you, and we're already independently required to comply with the GLBA. So some banks will do it, and then some banks won't. My advice is generally attempt to get your banks to sign it, because they're collecting a lot of personal information. Behooves the dealership. Puts you in it helps you mitigate your risk. But I think the banks probably are the least of your concerns from when you're trying to get these contracts signed. Really, who you're worried about are true service providers, DMS, CRM, credit companies, people that you're sharing the information with that are providing a service to your dealership. I think should be your biggest priority.
Great, thank you. If anybody has any questions, I don't see anything coming through in the chat. I know we're asking a lot of questions here. I'm going to kind of go back to Doug here a little bit. So Doug, I think everybody, when they look at your program, they look at their showroom, they look at their paperwork. I've always had a mantra, and it was paperless from handshake to F&I, paperless from F&I to accounting, and then paperless from accounting to filing. And, that's kind of a perfect world that we've all tried to achieve, but we all know is very difficult in the dealership. There's a lot of steps that we take in the dealership, is there, where do you store their information? How does it fit with where they're already storing their information?
You mean, where do we store it technically, or where do we store it?
Yeah, where does it go? Like, how does the process start? Just walk us through your process.
Yeah, so you know, the process starts no different than today. We capture a driver's license, maybe an insurance card. We digitally create a credit application to get that signed, and those all drop into an electronic deal jacket if they buy, or a dead deal jacket if they don't. So there is no more dead deal jacket administration. That's kind of built in line with the process. And then we run credit and do the red flags in the OFAC, and that all drops into the folder. And then, as Chris said, if they need STIPs or any document, we have a secure private network where they can request it directly from the folder, and it drops back in. So at the end of that process, when they walk into F&I, there's a digital deal jacket built with all the documents in there for the F&I producer, right? And from that point forward, they continue doing exactly what they do today. And if they're a Reynolds or a DocuPad customer, or a CDK customer, or even a DealerTrack DMS customer, they all have the ability to import that digital piece of our folder into their sold deal jacket for the customers that are delivered.
So do they have to run credit through your program?
That's an interesting question, and it's a pretty hard line in the sand, because the whole purpose of this platform is to eliminate the discretion, the variability. I'm going to skip this step because I'm busy. This is my brother-in-law. I don't need the paperwork, right? Or you know, my wife's at home. I promise she said it's okay for you to pull her credit. And those have led to problems in the past. So without the hard stop being the point where we run credit and then working backwards from there, the way the platform's built is the dealer gets to decide what documents, what signatures, what steps, what things need to be there for that gate to go up to run credit. That works backward to put that consistency in place. And if you don't run credit inside the system, the whole integrity of the process breaks down. Now, as you and I know, we have a couple dealers in New Jersey that just submit everything to the bank and don't run credit. They're still getting every piece of paper into our system. They're looking at our system before they submit it to make sure they've got consent, because even though the lender's running credit, the dealership's the facilitator for arranging that credit. So the same obligations exist. They're not running the credit bureau on their side. So yeah, 99 times out of 100, if you're not running credit through our platform, unless you're extremely disciplined, you're going to run into problems. So it's in the dealer's best interest to do that.
So one of the questions that came up is, how can you correct the situation with cell phone info and insurance info and get it off the salesperson's phone?
There's nothing out there that's going to guarantee it's not going to go on their phone, but I would say this: if I'm a dealer and I've got a secure, encrypted, private network where I can literally request and receive and safeguard every piece of paper that I can think of, customer night in my dealership, if I have a rogue salesperson who still wants it texted to their cell phone, I am in a much better position to separate a bad Apple employee from a bad Orchard dealership, and I've got a much more defensible platform to do that. I've got a policy in place. This is our corporate standard for doing this. I've got a rogue employee that violated our policies. You're never going to 100% stop that, but you're in a much better position if you've got a piece of technology in place. And frankly, it's much more efficient, because as a salesperson, even if I have it sent to my phone, I'm busy, I go talk to my next customer, nobody knows that's there until I decide to tell somebody, right? And that affects contracts in transit, that affects lots of other things. So it's not just a platform to receive it, it's a platform that sends off notifications that says, hey, Chris just sent us his pay stub from California. Now we know we have it. We asked him for it 5 minutes ago, and now we can go get this deal funded. We've done all that in a secure, private way.
Okay, so one of the questions that came up is, if it's a cash deal with no credit app, do you still have to follow the process?
You're going to still need to run an OFAC, right? You still need to, hopefully, I'm still going to verify, I want the driver's license, I want the, whatever I need that I typically correct to consummate the deal. But you have an obligation to have a clean OFAC on everybody that you deliver a car to. And cash deal, credit union, third party, it doesn't matter.
Can I chime in a little there too, Judy?
Yep.
So on a cash deal too, like a common issue, I want to clarify, like a lot of the term cash gets thrown around there. But like, there's a big difference obviously between like personal check and green money cash and a cashier's check and all that. But remember, if it's a cash deal over $10,000, you have IRS reporting obligations, in which case you're going to want to collect additional information up front. Like you're still going to need their social, you're going to need their occupation, you're going to need their date of birth and all that, because IRS requires that information as part of submitting the transaction. So you're still going to want to make sure you're doing all your due diligence on a cash deal. Also, I always just still ran a red flag, not a credit report, because you may not have the authorization to run credit, but at least a red flags report, because a lot of these deals these days, I mean, there's still wire fraud, there's still all sorts of money laundering and things that you're probably going to still want to know who you're doing business with. Kind of the old school mentality of, oh, well, I got money in the bank, why do I care? You got to be really careful these days, because that money could have dirty hands on it.
Very good. Thanks, Chris. And one of the advantages to Doug's program is that you're collecting every driver's license that you take for a test drive. So that includes your consumers and your customers. So if you can identify who's a consumer, who's a customer, and you've got every deal, every driver's license, every piece of paper in that deal that you've collected, it's all in one place. So you've always have access to it. One of the other questions that we have came up for Chris, and that's, could you explain vendor risk and contract management?
Yeah, so in the context of the revised safeguards rule, again, there's two requirements. One is that every vendor has to sign a contract with your dealership that collects non-public personal information or anything related to like a finance or a lease deal. You need to have them sign a contract that basically says they're going to protect your information, they're not going to resell it, they're only going to use it within the scope of the contract, certain representations like that. So every one of those vendors is going to need to sign that contract. And then from a risk assessment standpoint, each of your vendors also is going to need to complete a risk assessment where you as the dealership are basically having them complete like a questionnaire of sorts that would have them represent how secure they are. So for example, like does your company have secure password requirements? Have you done a pen test in the past 12 months? Or a penetration test? Have you done a vulnerability scan? Do you have your own written policies for information security? And if, for example, the vendors say no to all these things, you probably shouldn't be allowing them to have access to your personal information. So it's the FTC's way of making sure that you're only dealing with vendors who are secure. And there's a reason for this, right? I mean, a lot of these data breaches that have occurred in the past few years, it's not the dealership themselves getting hacked, or sometimes it is, but or it's not the financial institution. I mean, the classic example of this would be the recent Volkswagen and Audi data breach. It was 3 point something million records, but it wasn't Audi and Volkswagen, it was their vendor Shift Digital that had the breach, right? And so the FTC saying, well, it's your job to assess those vendors because at the end of the day, dealership is one dealership, but you may be dealing with 70 vendors. That's times 70 your risk multiplied. You need to make sure these vendors are also securely protecting your data.
So Chris, since your program directly addresses all of the cybersecurity issues, how does that tie into the dealership cybersecurity insurance?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So, and I forgot to mention that earlier, but yeah, I mean, cybersecurity insurance premiums, as the dealers, if any of you on this call are responsible for negotiating your cybersecurity insurance premiums, you probably saw an astronomical increase from last year because for the first time ever, cybersecurity insurance companies lost money and spent more money at paying out claims than they made on premiums, which is obviously is a losing deal for an insurance company, right? It's how they make money. So, and that's just because there were so many ransomware attacks, so many data breaches. I mean, like, seems like half the dealers I talk to these days have had a ransomware attack or some sort of cybersecurity incident in the past 5 years. And so they're paying out more claims than they were earning in premiums. So yeah, premiums spiked, and a lot of dealerships can't even get renewals on their cyber policies because they're not doing a lot of the things that we're talking about, right? So not only are these things now required by law, but a lot of insurance companies won't allow you to renew your policy for cybersecurity unless you're doing things like penetration testing, written risk assessments, can prove that you have these policies in place, can prove that you're assessing your vendors, right? And when you do those things, too, like kind of go above and beyond with the things like vulnerability scanning and all that, you can significantly reduce your premiums. I mean, I've talked to dealers that are using our software and doing the things that, that are required in there and have reduced their premiums by $50,000 to $60,000 a year. So a lot of the times our software can pay for itself just by virtue of helping reduce your cyber security premiums. If you don't have a cybersecurity insurance policy today, I mean, I don't know how to put this nicely, but you're out of your minds. I mean, because these things can cost you 6 to 7 figures if you have a ransomware attack and you got to pay the ransom to get your data back. I mean, these hackers are demanding 6 to 7 figures. And even if you don't pay the ransom, I mean, you're talking about doing forensics on, to figure out what was corrupted, whether you have to report a data breach to your state attorney general. I mean, again, these things are, typically costing the average dealership 6 to 7 figures. So you're going to want insurance to cover you on that for obvious reasons, or it could, potentially, especially for a smaller dealership, put you out of business potentially, right? So you definitely, if you don't already, again, I'm not an insurance company, I don't have any affiliation with one, but you need a cybersecurity insurance policy.
And what percentage of the dealers that you talk to have had a ransomware attack?
A crazy amount. And those are the ones that admit it to me. So, a lot of dealerships don't want that to be public information, but yeah, I've talked, it seems like, again, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say like half the dealers I've talked to have had something like a ransomware attack in the past few years where, somebody, and there's varying degrees, right? Sometimes it spreads across the entire network. Sometimes it can affect the DMS. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it only affects one computer. And luckily it stopped there because they had great firewalls and things in place. But it's very common, and dealerships have been a big target for 3 reasons. One is they have tons of non-public personal information, right, on their systems, social. I mean, dealerships collect everything under the sun. Dealerships traditionally haven't focused a lot on cybersecurity. So you have, a lot of dealerships that are targets because hackers know that dealerships don't have sophisticated cybersecurity policies. And I think the third one is there's a lot of turnover in dealership industry. Salespeople fresh out of high school, fresh out of college, whatever, that aren't trained on best practices for like suspecting or looking for fake phishing emails and things like that. So you're constantly having new people come in who may have never been trained and are going to click on that free pumpkin spice latte email, right, and download some malicious software on their PC. And I joke with there was a study that said that was the most commonly clicked on phishing email in the fall was the free pumpkin spice latte from Starbucks. You can believe it or not. And there's more sophisticated ones too, like that look like it's coming from your DMS. And the hackers are getting pretty. It's long gone are the days of the Nigerian prince sending you $10 million in inheritance, right?
Hey, Chris, I'm curious if you see similar experiences that we do on that. The ones that we've seen have been several large groups, and almost every one of them has been the last week of the month or in December. They're at the worst times where you're held hostage. Is that what you're experiencing as well?
Yeah, like especially in the holidays, yeah, the end of the month where they know you're going to be busier and your guard's going to be down. I mean, that tends to be the most common. But I mean, people are just getting hit with these things on a daily basis now. I mean, they're so common. I mean, they call it ransomware as a business because you have a lot of these Russian hacking groups that, I mean, they have HR departments. It is crazy. I mean, these people are very sophisticated and high level. I mean, a lot of these dealerships that have had ransomware attacks, I mean, they have customer, success managers that'll get on the phone with you. And I mean, it's really bizarre. But ransomware has become almost like commercialized among, hacking groups and stuff because it's so profitable. So yeah, I mean, they're getting pretty good.
And one last question for Michael. We talked a lot about you picking up and using your labor to do the scanning.
Yes.
How often are scanned documents picked up?
So typically on a day forward, particularly on the service side, it's usually the cycle is typically weekly. Sometimes that's shortened, sometimes it's lengthened, all depending on the throughput, number of rooftops, and volume. On backlog, that we were a different question, but we generally will work with a timeline and a budget that works for the customer if they're going back 6 months, a year, 2 years, things like that. Deals, typically we find it the case that the paper deals are typically held on to. I've seen the shortest cycle I've seen 4 to 6 weeks. That's the shortest cycle I've seen in order to populate a deal. Before it's released to us, and then appends can happen after the fact. The usual cycle is about 6 months to a year that deals are held on to before they're released to us, in effect. And then at some point,
they can access those, Michael.
Access generally on a day forward, usually 48 to 72 hours from once we've picked up, it's processed and online. If an expedite needs to happen, and happens all the time, we have a team of folks that do nothing but immediate access of stuff that is on the truck, finds its way back to a same day, and then accessible next morning, basically. So we're able to find it and get it up online immediately if need be, or call it back if they need the physical copy back.
And I would say one thing for all dealers to consider, like using a document scanning system like AutoTreeve, is from a safeguards perspective, one of the new requirements that you're able to audit who's looking at what and have secure protocols in place for example, your deal jackets. How do you do that with old school, like physical files, right? I mean, I remember the days you had a card and you put the card in. Of course, nobody followed that, so people just take deal jackets. You have no idea where it went, who's looking at it.
Good point, Chris.
Yeah, with a system like AutoTreeve, it's a lot easier to comply with that stuff because typically these systems have ways of, auditing a trail of who clicked on what, who looked at what, so you can make sure, if you ever have an incident, you're able to detect like which user is, acting maliciously or surreptitiously.
Good point. And just to extend upon that, thank you for raising that point. And typically hierarchy at the admin setup for access to anything. One is able to drive who has access to what documents at what rooftops, and then also a good point relative to the audit trail. Very easy to follow that crumb trail to see who has had access at what points if there's anything suspect, basically. So very hard to administer that in paper.
Right. Well, we're coming to the end, but I think everybody, if you look at the picture on the screen here, I think probably all of us feel like this right now. Like, oh my God, I can't believe this is what we're going to have to do. But two more real quick questions for Chris. If anybody needs to sign off, we understand. But what does contract maintenance mean specifically?
I think that's actually supposed to be contract management. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so contract management, I mean, I guess from a safeguards perspective, kind of like what I mentioned before, it's really going to have to do with your vendors, right? So the only kind of contractual requirement under the safeguards rule is having your vendors sign the required safeguards contracts, right? Which is required by law. And so
do you have to update those every year, Chris?
No, it's a common misconception. I get that question. A lot of these have to be updated. No, I mean, it's a contract, right? I mean, it's going to be, your standard safeguards contract wouldn't make sense for it to have a limit. I mean, they're required to, at least the template that we use and that I recommend says that they're going to safeguard your information and promise to do those things for as long as the term that you have them as a vendor is, right? So it shouldn't ever expire. Even typically after your relationship ends with that vendor, they'll still have an obligation by contract to protect that thing, protect those things if they don't destroy it, right? So no, it doesn't need to be done every year. It's a one-time thing that you're going to want to have all your vendors sign to comply with these new rules. But then once you have them sign it, you should be good to go from there.
Great. And then another question from Michael. Are the deals destroyed by AutoTreeve after being scanned?
And so the question is, only with express written consent of the customer do we destroy typically. Again, we provide everything is encrypted. And also secured, accessible online. Generally, from a quality control standpoint, at the onset with a newly onboarded client, we'll hold documents for a said period, notify the client, and they can inform us of whether or not they wish to destroy. If they do not, also, I made no mention of this earlier, we do provide long-term box record storage as well that's fully secure and certified. So if they wish, even though it's gray or their culture wants them to hold on to that paper, I literally have many thousands of boxes right now that we track, for those purposes. So, but we will destroy upon request, and then at the end of a retention period, we can be alerted by the customer on X date to finally destroy as well.
Right, and remember, if you're a group that's doing business in different states, some states, like for example California, still require that you hold on to things physically, for example, for at least 18 months. So you're going to want to make sure you're kind of consulting with your attorneys on that if you're doing business in different states.
Chris, to that point, we found that to be the case. It does float state to state, interpretations. Indeed. Thank you for pointing that out. Yep.
Okay, well, thank you to our wonderful expert panel today, and thank you for your time. We know that this was tough. Chris has got up nice and early for us. He's 2 hours behind us. But I think everybody, this was very informative, and hopefully you liked the format, and we know you all have a lot of work to do, and hopefully we can help you with that, or one of them can. You've got everybody's contact information here. So if you have want any information on any of the programs, you can contact them directly, or again, you can contact myself and Gail. So thank you all for attending today. If you have any other questions, we will be sending out Again, the manual that we distributed on the webinar last month, which is the safeguards manual with the updates that Chris put together for us. And we will also be sending out kind of a trifold of the 3 programs again, so that if you want to pursue or you want to do it on your own, you have the ability to do that. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Brian, for putting this together, and everybody have a very great day.
Just so I do need to tell one more thing. Again, I'd echo what Judy said. Thank you to Doug, Chris, Michael, and Judy. And thank you to everybody who participated today. A recording of today's webinar, as well as the slides, will be posted on the NJCAR website later today, in case anyone missed some of the presentation, or there are others in your dealership you feel should have access to the information that was provided. So thanks again, and that concludes today's webinar. Thank you, and stay safe, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all.